Well, on the basis of this, the BBC reports 1918 killer flu secrets revealed. Scientists have worked out how the virus which caused the world's worst flu epidemic infected man. The virus which claimed the lives of 50 million people around the world jumped from birds to human. The breakthrough, published in Science, will help doctors identify which future bird viruses pose a threat to man at an earlier stage. But the National Institute for Medical Research team warns that the viruses cannot be stopped from crossing between the species. And so the drumbeat goes on. And what, indeed, is the reality that underlies this enormous propaganda campaign? Plum Island, Lab 257. Nestled near the Hamptons, the fashionable summer playground of America's rich and famous, and in the shadow of New York City, lies an unimposing 840-acre island unidentified on most maps. On the few on which it can be found, Plum Island is marked red or yellow and stamped U.S. Government Restricted or Dangerous Animal Diseases. Though many people lead the good life within a scant mile or two from its shores, few know the name of this pork-chop-shaped island. Even fewer can say whether it's inhabited or why it doesn't exist on the map. Lab 257, the disturbing story of the government's secret Plum Island germ laboratory, blows the lid off the stunning true nature and history of Plum Island. This seemingly bucolic island on the edge of the largest population in the United States is a ticking biological time bomb that none of us can safely ignore. This is a report on the book by Michael Christopher Carroll, Lab 257, the disturbing story of the government's secret Plum Island Germ Laboratory, based on innumerable declassified government documents and scores of in-depth interviews. The suspenseful account of the federal government germ laboratory exposes a secret world and startling revelations, including virus breakouts, biological meltdowns, infected workers, and periodic flushing of contaminated raw sewage into the New York area waters, and the insidious connection between Plum Island and the created Lyme disease, as well as the deadly 1999 West Nile virus outbreak, which has its origin in the laboratories of Plum Island. This work shows how the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which ran Plum Island for the last half-century, says it states far more than a wholesome grade A eggs and food pyramid. In fact, Plum Island's new owner, the Department of Homeland Security, has carried on with this work of creating viruses, of generating germs, of weaponizing for application throughout the world the biological agents that induce and cause pandemics.
You're listening to Maya Schoen and Ralph Schoenman, Creating the Next Pandemic, Part 1. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. I was very interested to hear you mention Lab 257. I have a good friend who has a very bad case of Lyme's disease, and he showed me that book just a few weeks ago.
Yes, Bonnie, Lyme disease is but the small bit of the arsenal that's come out of Lab 257, and Lab 257 is just a headliner of the labs that proliferate across the United States. Bonnie, I just came back from a 4-day conference in Madrid, which involved delegates from 80 countries, and part of the work of that conference was the Africa Tribunal, which has been documenting frankly, the planned genocide of the population of the continent. Scientists and governments and health agencies now are projecting 90 million people to die of AIDS within the decade in Africa. This is a holocaust of the population of Africa, and part of the work that we have been in the process of developing includes the following. In 1987, the London Times published a front-page article in which they reported that a grid had been placed over the areas in Africa where the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control had imposed vaccination. In fact, these government agencies and private outsourced companies had made a deal with Mobutu in the Congo, and they'd actually leased huge areas of the Congo. And these programs of so-called vaccination were imposed upon the population. The London Times reports that when you placed a grid over the areas where these vaccinations occurred, there was a one-to-one correlation with the clusters of AIDS that emerged therein. The AIDS phenomenon and pandemic has the same character as this very avian flu and influenza pandemic that we're describing here. And the work that we did in Madrid with this international conference bore upon the fact that the system of private ownership of the means of production, so concentrated in the hands of the few, finds itself, in a sense, at war with the mass of the people of the world, because the impoverization and the epidemic disease that has been inflicted upon people has created a climate of insurrection. And the climate of insurrection is not latent. It is blatant, because people feel helpless, hopeless, and without anywhere to turn but to reject the system that has done this to them. And the populations themselves are targeted, no less than our own people. This is not some arcane mystery or a matter of a few evil people in any given administration. It is a part of a process through which the system itself is pitted against the populations over which it exercises such exploitative control. I think Lab 257 is a very important evidentiary demonstration of how this is operating. Leonard Cohen's book, Clouds of Secrecy, which you and I have discussed on air so many times, documents 40 years of this sort of thing. And in the very Bay Area where we live, trillions of bacilli and spores of brain and spinal meningitis were released on the Bay Area, and over something like a tenfold increase in those two diseases here. So this is nothing very arcane or conspiratorial as such. It is rather a description of a system that is in terminal decay, and what we really concluded at the conference is that the crisis of this system is the crisis of humanity. And this evidentiary work that we attempt to do in these two programs is by way of showing the architecture and outline of what is happening.